right, well, let's get to it, shall we? I'm very, very excited that we will be hearing from 3 different representatives of health professionals for a healthy climate and 350. Yep. Is it just health 350? And then 350, thank you, sorry about that. So we're going to hear today from Dr. Laalitha Surapaneni. Thank you, sorry. Sonita, Leeuw, and Dr. Dan Trajano. Dr. Laalitha, I will say. And actually, we're going to get started with Dr. Laalitha, so please come on up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, everybody. I think I spoke with your group back during the thick of the pandemic through Zoom. And at that time, we spoke about the health impact of climate change very broadly. But today we're going to zoom in on air quality and air pollution and climate change and how this all plays a role in our health. Hopefully you can all hear me. So when we think about climate air pollution, often what comes to mind is very thick, foggy, smoggy skies where planes can't take off, you can't see anything, and something that happens in very faraway places like India and China. But according to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, even in Minnesota, air pollution is costing lives. So as you can see here, this is particular to the Twin Cities, but the full data shows that in the Twin Cities and in the greater Minnesota region, air pollution is contributing to premature deaths. 10% of all deaths is quite a big number from the Twin Cities. So we'll do a little bit of terminology going with the nursing. So when, most of our air pollution comes from burning fossil fuels. And when we burn fossil fuels, there's 3 big categories of pollutants that come up. And the EPA classifies these into 3 things. So the first thing is criteria air pollutants. And when you hear news about air pollution or hear about air quality, this is what we're talking about behind the scenes is criteria air pollutants. So the common ones you might hear about are particulate matter, nitrous oxides, SO2, that's your sulfur dioxide or acid rain causing chemical, and ground level ozone. And then of course we know about greenhouse gases, and there's also 188 pollutants that the EPA classifies as hazardous air pollutants. Something like mercury that would come out by burning coal. So air pollution has been studied. Don't be afraid of this slide. There's a lot of information on this, but we'll go through this. Air pollution has been studied now since the 1950s and has been studied all over the world, both short-term and long-term effects. So we have tons and tons of data. And unfortunately, air pollution impacts virtually every single organ in the body. So if you were to focus on the heart, there's, risk of premature death from heart-related issues, high blood pressure, heart failure hospitalizations, myocardial infarction or heart attacks, and atrial fibrillation or an abnormal heart rhythm. So there's an increased risk for all of these conditions. But then there's also a causal incidence with particulate matter that is 2.5 microns in size and cardiovascular related deaths. So as you might all know, causal evidence is the gold standard in medicine. And to establish that link, we need a lot of data to establish, is it just a correlation or causation is often what we talk about. So we need a lot of data to establish this link. In a sense, we can say, just with so much certainty that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer, we're now able to say, air pollution causes death from cardiovascular issues. Now, when it comes to lungs, there's decreased lung function, and children are especially impacted. Yeah, I think I'm in the slide. Children are especially impacted. And once again, there's a causal link to development of childhood asthma. So not just kids with asthma who get a flare during air pollution, but actually new cases of childhood asthma from air pollution. Lung cancer is now the second leading cause of air pollution is the second leading cause of lung cancer. If these cases have gone up as tobacco smoking is going down, air pollution related lung cancer is going up. And most of the burden is in Southeast Asia. Again, there's increased ER visits for asthma exacerbations, pneumonia in children, risk of type 2 diabetes, impacts to brain health with stroke, increased risk of Parkinson's, dementia, anxiety and depression. Our kidneys are affected with chronic kidney disease risk. And terrifyingly, particulate matter crosses the placenta, and it can lead to preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy, which in itself can have adverse outcomes for the fetus. But then we also see low birth weight, preterm birth, stillbirths, and there's impacts to the development of the brain of the fetus, and they're measuring this like 2 years into the child's life with language development skills and cognitive function. So this is all what we call, most of the times when we discuss air pollution and all of this, we're talking about ambient air pollution or outdoor air pollution, but then there's also air pollution that happens indoors. And the EPA has standards for outdoor air pollution, but none for indoor air pollution. So you may have all seen in the news that there was this huge, discussion about gas stoves and gas stove related pollution. So when we burn methane gas or natural gas indoors, it creates the same pollution as it would when you burn it outdoors. So during cooking and heating our homes, you see high levels of nitrous oxide that has been linked to increased rates of asthma for children and stunted lung growth, like we saw, as well as respiratory infections that put kids in the hospital. And in Minnesota, we have wood burning, which is a big source of air pollution. The picture here the graph comes from like data from 2014, but there's now 2015 data, and that number has decreased to 55% of fine particles of PM2.5, but that's still a pretty significant amount of pollution. And we just spoke about, how many organs are impacted by those particulate matter. As always, with everything related to the environment, the impacts that we just talked about are not distributed evenly. So more than 1 in 3 Americans currently live in places that are unhealthy air. And in Minnesota, the likelihood of living next to a polluting facility is higher in communities of color and low-income communities. And while the data is reported that way, I just want to say that, people don't choose to live next to polluting facilities. These facilities are often cited in these areas. Now, when we, there's a lot of these impacts, but who is at most risk from this? So as I practice at the U of M, I, see patients who are hospitalized often related to heart and lung issues. And so when I'm thinking about counseling them about air pollution risks, I try to put this through this framework, which is 3 main components that I think about. So the first one is exposure, right? Like who is going to have the maximum amount of exposure. So for example, last year when the wildfire smoke was so high, I had a patient who came in who mows lawns and does like outdoor gardening work. And so he would have a lot of exposure because he's outdoors. Then the second part is sensitivity. So even if a healthy young person is exposed to wildfire smoke, they're not automatically going into the ER, right? So like people who have underlying, medical conditions. So my patient had underlying cystic fibrosis. So that's a lung condition that predisposes them. Or children, elderly, and pregnant women are at increased risk. And then who has adaptive capacity? So that's another thing that I think about. So adaptive capacity is anything that can decrease the risk from this exposure. So, if they can work from home, if they have an air filter at home, they're really not exposing themselves to as much wildfire smoke during the event. Unfortunately, my patient was wearing an N95 mask, but even despite taking all the precautions and he had an air filter at home, despite all of that, he ended up in the hospital. But this is a framework to, think about who's at risk, but also how can we protect ourselves and improve, our adaptive capacity to stave off some of those health impacts. Climate change plays a role in air quality. So in 3 different ways that we will talk about. The first one is ozone. So we all know the good ozone, which is up in the stratosphere, the ozone layer. But then when there's air pollution on a hot day, and those hotter days are getting more common because of climate change, the pollutants within the air react with each other and form a new chemical, which is the ground level ozone. And that is very harmful to lung health. So on hot days, we see that there's higher rates of ER visits for asthma exacerbations or ambulance calls for respiratory related problems. And you're not in a city, but because of wildfire smoke, you can still see ozone forming in areas where there's not too much, typically it forms in urban heat islands where there's a lot of traffic and there's pollution there, but because of wildfire smoke, it's not happening outside of the metro areas. The other big air quality impact from climate change is from pollen. So we are already seeing that there's a rise in the amount of pollen, how early the pollen season starts, and how long it's lasting. And so on the top, what you can see, I'm not sure you can see it so well on the screen, but the pollen counts is on the top, and the pollen season start date is in the bottom. Yeah, I don't think you can see the map project onto there. I'm sorry, but you'll have the slides available to you. The other big way that our air quality is being impacted is the wildfire smoke. So what's in wildfire smoke often depends on what's burning, what's the temperature that it's burning at, and how far away are we from the source. But typically, if what we get is the Canadian wildfire smoke, so the heavy metals, asbestos, those things don't travel as far down south. But what does travel is the particulate matter, which causes a lot of these health impacts we spoke about. And unfortunately, there's early evidence to show that the PM2.5 that comes from wildfire smoke is more damaging than the PM2.5 that comes from burning fossil fuels. You can see here that there's also things like benzene, which is linked to leukemias and other impacts to our blood. And there's nitrogen oxides, which once again irritate our lungs and lead to increased rates of asthma. So these are all the documented impacts of wildfire smoke. Once again, you'll see the similarity with what we already talked about, where there's more premature deaths, there's ER visits, there's lung and heart issues, preterm births. Once again, there's environmental injustice where Black Americans are more exposed and also have higher rates of hospital admission from wildfire smoke. And there's a lot of health impacts that have been monetized and anywhere between 11 billion and 20 billion in 2010 dollars. So but you can only imagine how much last year's wildfire smokes must have cost us. So how do we protect ourselves from wildfire smoke? This video, there's a video from the EPA that talks about setting up a clean air room. So basically one room in the house where there's no smoke. So, no wood fire, no cigarette smoking, no gas stove or anything like that. And that room, if you can have an HVAC system in your house, that's great. But even in that one room, having NERV 13 or above air filter, and having good ventilation and an air conditioning in that room, so that you can spend most of the time in that room and limit your exposure to wildfire smoke. And if you must go outside wearing a 95 mask, it doesn't totally take away all the exposure, but it reduces it significantly. And of course, we are all very familiar with monitoring air quality. It's now in most of our weather apps with the AQI. In places like California, they're also doing this at a public policy level where they're setting up clean air centers where people can just go stay there during the wildfire smoke like peak. But it's becoming so common in California that they're spending like several months exposed to smoke. So not sure how this is going to be a solution. But at least for the unhoused, this would be an option because they have another option. And then in Minneapolis, we have an asthma program where if you have someone that's 21 years or younger, the city comes out to your house and helps you with providing free air filters, and they can help change out the pillow, mattress, and other allergens in your house that may cause asthma. So we need more of these programs so that we're providing options so that not everybody can get to the clean air room. So helping provide those individual solutions. And as always, I think as we talk about a just transition, it's very important to think about how do we make sure that this policies we're implementing benefits everybody, because in the cities, a lot of the air pollution exposure is determined by where you live. And so you can't really ask people to move when they have asthma that's being triggered by air pollution. So how do we address that environmental injustice? And we'll be talking about electric school buses, so hopefully that plays a role into cleaning up the air. But then also thinking about workers and their health, because with increasing wildfire smoke, there will be more need for firefighters to be out there. So how do we help them and help preserve their health as well? Thank you.
Yeah, we'll do questions at the end. And we should have a good amount of time. I'll try to get through some of this.
Heath and I are going to talk about electric school buses. I'm Dr. Trajano. I'm actually a retired physician, but I still teach part-time at the University of Minnesota and the University of St. Thomas, and then on the board for health professionals for climate, and do a lot of volunteer organizing. And 50 been focused on organizing around one opportunity, a big opportunity that impacts both health and climate, where climate pollution and health sort of come together, and that is air quality on school buses for our kids. And it's been great for the past 3.5 years to see what's happening in that space of school bus transportation, because now we have availability of the zero emission electric school buses where kids on those buses have no tailpipe, are not going to be exposed to any of all of that air pollution that Laalitha is talking about inside of electric school buses, because we know that those diesel emissions are really, really harmful for kids' health. So my contact information is here. A detailed slide set is there if you want to snap a picture with your phone on that QR code. We'll probably email out the presentation as well. But if you are interested in this topic, especially, reach out to me. We're looking for people to organize in the communities to get our kids on safer transportation to school. Now is a great time. Right now, there is a lot of funding available for communities to get these school buses for their schools. Sonita is going to talk a little more in detail about all of the funding nationally that's available, and new funding statewide that is also available for Minnesota. that we've been involved with. So I'll tell you what drove me to this, right? Someone asked, Amendment 350 asked, hey, you know, we're done with the election campaign. Should we organize around something else to get people involved in a climate topic? And I think Grant Stevens said the same thing. You know, take a look at electric school buses. Would that be of interest to you? I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know much about the technology or about the issue of diesel emissions or other fossil fuel emissions that kids were exposed to in school buses. So I took my physician hat. Well, let me take a look and see what kind of research is out there. And what became really evident to me is that, wow, this is a children's health issue as much as a climate issue. So both of those things coming together is where I think I can really serve as a physician and a climate advocate. And it led to a lot of great things, including my wife, Paula, here is in the yellow there, and our friend Brooke Roper, who is now on the Hopkins School Board, and her son, CJ. We all were able to testify at the Minnesota House a couple of years ago now, and actually get $13 million of funding passed in that legislative session in 2023 for specifically electric school buses in Minnesota. And I'll tell you what's really compelling. You know, my wife and I are both retired doctors. We're not the most powerful people in this slide that testified. That is Brooke and her son CJ at the House. They both have asthma. And asthma is the #1 chronic disease of children. About 1 in 12 children nationwide have asthma. So if you're sitting on a school bus filled with 70 kids, a good number of them likely have asthma and are being impacted by breathing all of that particulate matter or nitrous oxide that are coming from those engines. And that was true for Brooke, and CJ was in kindergarten at the time. He didn't ride the school bus regularly, but he was on a field trip on a school bus, and he is one that has been hospitalized in the emergency room with asthma. And when he came back home, Brooke was just freaked out because he was not breathing right. And she thought, well, that must be from riding on the bus. He doesn't ride the bus regularly. Fortunately, with treatment at home and breathing better air at home, he didn't have to go to the ER at that time. But that is, that kind of personal, compelling story of why we want to do this. Now we have technology where kids don't have to be exposed to anything inside that school bus. And so Brooke is just a fierce advocate now on the school board, probably because of this issue of trying to, and we met with Hopkins School Board now, and hopefully they'll start applying for funding for these buses. So CJ, when he's riding on a bus, doesn't have to be exposed to all of that stuff. But CJ's not the only one. Again, 1 in 12 kids have asthma. And so there are, hundreds of thousands of kids across Minnesota that are potentially going to have asthma and not have to be exposed to some of these emissions. So we have a handout in the back. This is our HPHC Health Professionals Are Healthy Climate handout. There is now $5 billion. Well, half of it's already been spent over the past couple of years, but there's still $2.5 billion remaining in the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA Clean School Bus Program that can be given for schools to electrify their school bus fleets. In some priority districts, particularly your rural remote districts or tribal districts, or districts of a more significant poverty, they can almost get a completely free paid for school bus with that. Other districts, non-priority, it probably pay for half of a brand new school bus for them. So the finances, in many cases, most cases, if you get funding, are probably going to look very good for your schools. Probably actually save them money on transportation. If you look at how these buses actually save in terms of fueling costs compared to charging it up on electric compared to having to buy diesel fuel, how they save on maintenance because much fewer moving parts, they don't break down, there's no oil changes involved. So the finances probably going to work out very positively if a school applies for and gets some funding for these school buses. But the health benefits are huge, and the climate benefits as well. So what we do know is that there's a lot of interest out there in Minnesota, and there's not enough funding. And that's why we went to legislators and said, we need more funding for these things. People are interested in getting these things. We've had school districts throughout Minnesota apply for over $225 buses either through the federal program or through the state Volkswagen settlement. So the MPCA had a program, but only 33 school bus grants and rebates have been awarded to Minnesota schools. So a lot of schools want these buses. There's just not enough available funding. And one of those programs is a rebate lottery. If you don't apply, you don't get a ticket to potentially get funding. And others are grant programs where you have to write competitive grants and why our school district may deserve these monies for school buses. This slide you maybe can't read in the back, but you can look at the slide set. This is sort of a summary of what I found when I did that research. Well, why should I organize around electric school buses? There are actually two very compelling studies, randomized studies, showing that kids who are riding in buses that have less diesel emission exposure compared to older school buses do better on their health, attend school more often, and do better on their academic test score outcomes. Two very, very compelling randomized studies looking at these kids that are exposed to less diesel emissions have better school attendance by about 8%. This was a study down in Washington State. They have better lung function tests, actual spirometry lung function tests. They can move more air in and out. They have less exhaled nitric oxide, which is an inflammatory test of the lungs. Asthma is an inflammatory disease. And those kids attended school more often, especially those kids who had underlying asthma. The other study was done in Georgia. They did testing on their academic test score outcomes. Significantly better English language arts scores. And then better, but not to a statistical degree, math scores. And they do their aerobic fitness testing. Those kids that were in those buses not exposed to as many diesel fumes did better on their run and walk fitness tests. Their aerobic capacity was better. So when I read those studies, I said, yeah, Grant, we should organize around this and get more of our kids in Minnesota on electric zero emission school buses. And then the funding has come during that time that really make economic sense for schools to do this. And we see schools across the United States taking advantage of this. In some ways more than Minnesota schools. We're trying to get the word out in Minnesota. And if you're interested in organizing with us, please reach out to me or Sonita or any of us. And then, you know, climate is huge, right? And I hope I'm talking to a lot of you that understand that, you know, the World Health Organization, the CDC, we all recognize that the medical community all recognizes that when you look at climate change, it is the biggest threat to human health that we face right now. And I, you know, you listen to Laalitha, it's like, yeah, it is. And it, you know, this is right inside of all the medical literature. New England Journal, The Lancet. We all know this. We just need to act. And a school bus over its lifetime will emit 90 tons of carbon. And once we get to zero emission school buses across the US, that's 5.3 million tons of carbon that won't be released into the atmosphere every year. 5.3 million, right? They talk about carbon capture, you know, maybe 100,000 tons of carbon in this new carbon capture technology. 5.3 million tons of less carbon once we get our US fleet electrified. So it's significant. School buses are probably one of the first things we should really think about electrifying. I think that's why Congress bipartisan way put out $5 billion. This is about the economics. You know, there's funding, might cover a lot of that. They do cost more. You know, a electric school bus might cost $400,000 versus a diesel bus, which is about 130. I talked to Nick Martini, one of the school transportation folks. But the funding will cover a lot of that if you can get a grant or a rebate. But the fuel and maintenance costs, and this is real life experience, we talked to our Michigan colleagues a lot. We're seeing between $4,000 and $11,000 of savings in fuel and maintenance cost every year for an electric school bus versus their diesel bus. And then really cool, because this can be used to support the grid And we're seeing this done in several school districts now where in the summertime, school buses aren't being used, but they use that battery as an asset to plug into the grid so they can store that battery, charge that battery up overnight when there's low demand. And then when the peak demand comes, when people have to turn on their natural gas or coal peaker plants, they can actually use the bus battery instead to feed to the grid to cover some of that that high cost demand. And in they did the pilot in Massachusetts for 2 years. They were earning with the electric utility company almost $12,000 per bus per summer to sell that peak demand back because it's really expensive energy to turn on a peaker. So there is, if you can actually sit and actually Excel, is going to be piloting this in the upcoming year with a couple of school buses. So this is reality today in some states. It will be reality in the upcoming year with Excel. And do you guys Minnesota Power up here, or what is it? It's a mix. Yeah, and it may be a great discussion to have with the utility company. Hey, this works. Could we begin to do that if we got an electric school bus up here? So there are some calculators on total cost of ownership, and your school leaders can go through that. Hey, if we get a grant or something, what will that cost us for a school bus compared to a diesel bus? Here's a case where non-priority district got some money. Over the lifetime of a bus, 12, 13, 14 years, it's going to cost less. The upfront costs are going to be higher, maybe covered by some grant funding. But when you look at the fuel and maintenance savings, it's going to cost less. And then, there's a lot of propane people out there saying, oh, propane's okay. Or you switch to propane. That actually probably has more carbon impact on the climate change than a diesel bus. Maybe a little better in terms of nitric oxide or particulate matter, a little bit less. But it has more carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide coming out of those things, which are damaging to the brain as well. So I wouldn't go to propane. It's kind of like going to a Betamax from a VHS tape. And the funding is not as great for propane. Funding for electric is much better. So we're looking for organizers. We organize. We've been to school board meetings. We've been to the legislature. We help people do that. What I really love is when we get young people involved, and we've helped several students go to their school board successfully. And so these are folks in Rosebud, Apple Valley, Egan. Those two students, they went to the school board, and then the school board said, yeah, we're going to apply for 6 buses. These are folks in Edina. They went to the school board. And the school board a couple weeks said, yeah, we're going to apply for a couple of buses in Edina. Sonita and I went to Minneapolis. They actually are purchasing 4 buses. And that came about after our school board meeting with them. The 5th grade class, one of the 5th grade teachers was teaching about climate change. He had the 5th graders write to the school administration saying, hey, we know about these electric school buses and we're worried about climate change. I think that was those young people were the ones that sort of convinced Minneapolis to say, yeah, we're going to get 4 buses. We got 2 funded and we're going to buy 2 outright, which is great for students' health, great for the climate, great for students' advocacy. So if you know students anywhere up in this area that want to advocate, we are here to help them. And I do have a toolkit with all sorts of presentations, examples, and emails to school board members and other resources. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Sonita, who's going to kind of go through the funding, and then we'll take some questions. So working on the size? No, thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, awesome. So great to be here with all of you all today. I will try and talk a little bit quicker just so we can get to, if any of you have questions, would love to address those. But really quick, for a quick introduction, my name is Sonita Leeuw. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I work for MN350, which is an environmental advocacy group that we are based in Minneapolis, but work throughout the state. And I'm so excited to be here up in Ely. I haven't been here since I was like 8. So first time back in a while, which I'm really excited about. And I was also so excited Chocolate Mousse is still here, which I also really enjoy. But
So yeah, I am their transportation organizer. So what that means is I get to help organize with incredible people that you've just heard from, additionally with other organizations, coalitions, and really just trying to bring everyone together surrounding how can we get electric school buses in Minnesota and kind of figuring out those PowerPoints and sort of like where are the hot spots, how can we make this happen? So I'm just going to give a quick overview of sort of what's already happened in Minnesota. I don't know if many folks know this, but Minnesota was actually the first state in the entire Midwest to get an electric school bus. This was back in 2017. It was in Lakeville. And this bus today is still running. It is still operating, which is really exciting for multiple reasons. One being, you know, we've had some pretty extreme winters since then. And additionally, as time moves on, more and more studies also, we can use this bus to be able to say, hey, it works. You know, this is how it worked after 5 years, after 10 years, use it as a tool. And then in 2022, that is when the federal funding started to trickle through. Back in 2021, the Biden administration had passed an Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, which was the first large act taken, at a federal level around climate change. This funded a bunch of fantastic different programs, including the Clean School Bus Program, which will be taking $5 billion and to spread that across 5 fiscal years. So basically $1 billion per fiscal year, or I like to reference them as rounds. And so in 2022, Minnesota only submitted 30 applications and we only got 3 buses. But since then, you know, we've really been picking up our feet, and I joined MN 350 right after the first rebate round closed. And so kind of got to see, okay, here's where Minnesota stepped up. Here's where, unfortunately, we weren't being a leader. You know, this wasn't being taken seriously. The school districts didn't know about it. And so going into 2023, with the legislative session, we had just gotten the DFL trifecta. And so this was a great opportunity for movement organizations across the state and across multiple issues to get funding secured. And that is exactly what we did. Like Dan had just mentioned, we were able to advocate, organize, and get a $13 million electric school bus grant program. That's going to be deployed through the Department of Commerce. And this program could bring Minnesota up to 30 electric school buses. And we have made sure that this program is as inclusive as possible and making sure that all communities are able to apply for this. And also the one difference between this program and the federal program is we're not competing with the entire United States. We are just in our home state. And so this will be a great way. Hopefully that will roll out throughout this year and get our students, you know, on these buses. And then this year, there's a bunch of different programs that are available. I already touched on the Department of Commerce program, and so I'm just going to jump down to, these are all the state programs. So lots of options going on this year. It's a big year for electric school buses. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they have money through their Volkswagen settlement, and over the last 2 kind of phases for them, they have had the opportunity to fund electric school buses, and our coalition basically submitted a letter when they were crafting the final phase of this funding and said, hey, we need electric school buses, and we also need funding for charging infrastructure. And in their draft plan, they will be having 2.1 million going to electric school buses, and then 2.1 million for EV charging stations, which is something that's also super important. You know, if we get all these buses, that's amazing, but we want to make sure that they are being supported and able to be charged and run the full time. And also that's when it's really important to loop in utilities and make sure that coordination is happening, so then the grid is reliable. And this has worked in multiple other cities and other states across the United States. And then finally, with Excel, speaking of utilities, they have their pilot vehicle to grid program that will have 2 electric school buses. And this is kind of, we had advocated for more, but this is sort of looked at as an opportunity for Excel to really test their V2G technology and then expand it from there. So long story short, this is a very exciting year for electric school buses, and that's why it is so important that we are organizing and getting people involved and excited about it while it's available. And right now, actually, there is a program available called the Clean Heavy Duty Vehicles Grant Program. That is $1 billion that will be going towards medium and heavy duty vehicles. And school buses are included in this. That will be closing on July 25th. And this is a program that school districts can apply to, or the bus contractor. And this is something that, you know, I'd be more than happy to kind of talk through. And I have a handout in the back that kind of breaks this down a little bit more. We're more than happy to talk to people about this upcoming program and the additional ones that are to come. And then my final slide is, it's more about that, but my final slide is that you have the power to create change. I was really excited even hearing all of your community announcements, because I was like, man, this group knows how to organize. You guys have so many different events going on. And so I know I don't need to go too much into how to make these things happen, but like, you know, has been mentioned already in this presentation, it's a really exciting opportunity, but it's going to take all of us to do it. And even if it starts with that initial conversation with either a school board member or your superintendent, or if you know someone at the bus company, or even your neighbor. You know, I know that I don't ride a school bus, but I have school buses running through my neighborhood every day. I used to take walks and I would avoid the blocks where they would idle. So this is an issue that impacts all of us, and again, it will take all of us to do so. So anyway, apologies for the fast pace, but would love to leave a little time for questions. So thank you so much.
Wow, I'm just feeling a lot of gratitude right now. We get to come together every week and learn from people like these very intelligent professionals who came all this way to educate us. That's so cool. Carol, you have a question?
Hi, thank you so much. This is wonderful. 2 questions. What's the 350 about?
Yeah, that is a great question. Should have touched on that. The 350 is 350 parts per million, and that is that's a part of a national group, where it's the 350 movement. It's 350.org, and then Minnesota is just we're like the Sierra Club where we have chapters.
I remember.
Yeah, yes. No problem.
Ely has propane buses. Can you tell us, are they better than diesel? How much better? How, you know, how good or bad are they?
You know, I think, like I said, is Betamax better than VHS? I personally don't think they are. Well, actually, they're worse if you look at the data from a climate change perspective. How much greenhouse gas they're emitting? Really? They're slightly worse. So it's a mixed bag. They're somewhat better in terms of, maybe I'll just do PM 2.5, small particulate matter. I think they would say on the short run test that they're better on nitric oxide, although they didn't do long run tests on that. My wife Paula actually read the research studies really closely. But they are worse in terms of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, which those things impact your brain, as you know, carbon monoxide poisoning and whatnot. So you know, yeah, it's slightly better than a diesel bus. Maybe it's not too bad that you have propane versus diesel, but if you're going to get new buses, I would bypass the Betamax and go right to the Netflix.
Gotcha.
I would, and the funding is so much higher for an electric school bus.
Yeah, and I think with propane and with electric as well, but like for all of them, comparing the life cycle impacts is very important. So if we're doing propane, we're still reliant on the entire fossil fuel, you know, infrastructure and life cycle. I have a handout that someone gave me here, so I'm gonna give them my calling out of mic, and I'm gonna pass this along.
I'm just gonna say quick, if you are super nerdy, I brought with me a copy of, there is an advocacy agency for propane, PERC, and they did a study at the University of West Virginia. And I have the actual data, which is wonderful to look at, because they will, of course, cherry pick things out of it and say, hey, propane is better than diesel. And they put a lot of money into that message, so it really gets out there. I hear that from people, but that's why I bring the copy of the actual data with me sometimes. So if you want to look at actually like how much carbon monoxide comes out of the engine every mile, it can be it can even be over 3 grams of carbon monoxide from the propane bus. And it was also interesting looking at the study in that they would do non-real life scenarios like a 2-minute route or a 5-minute route, because I think they were thinking it would look better if the engine wasn't running very hot. So it's just very interesting to look at. And if you want to geek out with me, we can look at that.
Thanks. Thank you.
Is the Minnesota's electric grid up to snuff to, be able to charge all these electric buses, or we need some work in that area before we can start talking electric school buses across the state or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, we have a few of these right now. I wouldn't worry about getting 100 more. I personally, I think you have to look at the grid and work with the utility company on what infrastructure you need, because sometimes you'll need a different upgrade on a transformer or something to carry that, particularly if they're going to get these really fast chargers for their school buses. Although a lot of school buses are operating just on level 2, the medium charge. And can be charged almost fully, overnight. So I think the grid question is a good one. However, like I was saying with the vehicle grid, I support the grid in the summer, and then most often, you charge most of it overnight on low demand when the grid is not being stressed. Now, some longer routes they might want to top off midday. And there might be some stress on the grid if you have, thousands of electric buses that are topping off midday. I wouldn't worry. I'm not an electrical engineer, but in terms of the low demand energy at night, I don't think that's where we worry about the grid. And that's when most of that charging occurs on school buses and electric vehicles in general. We charge our electric vehicle overnight, low cost rate. Same thing would be for a school bus, low cost rate overnight, because the utility knows it's not stressing the grid. We want people to charge overnight at half the rate. And that's how you get a lot of that savings. So great question about the grid, right?
Sure.
When you talk about effects of like cigarette smoke, secondhand smoke, or even inhaling from a forest fire when you were kids, is that all cumulative in your lungs, or do the lungs get rid of that? Or say you were exposed to secondhand smoke as a youngster, you haven't smoked, and now there's, you go to bars, they don't smoke. Do your lungs have that damage forever, or is it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so for air pollution, because so much of the, vehicular air pollution, let's say, and like you grow up, your kid growing up next to a highway or something, so then you have that exposure constantly. And so those kids, you see that their lung function is low, and that can carry into young adulthood. But when the kids move away from the area of pollution, there's at least like their asthma rates and asthma exacerbations and so on go down. For wildfire smoke though, there's not data yet. They have shown that kids the lung inflammation seems to improve once the wildfire smoke exposure goes away. But because in places like California, the exposure now is like months, and then it's persistent every year. So they're doing a long-term study in California trying to figure that out for children's health. Yeah.
Okay, and then going back to the buses, the kids obviously are doing better. The data shows that. I can understand they're not polluting into the atmosphere. The exhaust isn't getting sucked into the bus. Is it recirculated air though, or how come all the exhaust from the trucks they're following and so forth doesn't get sucked into through the window? Or is it just not?
We talked to those folks from Michigan a while back.
And I, you know, partly if it was open, it's actually worse, because stuff is coming in. And the, you know, the way they did the study in Michigan was they actually had they looked at air quality inside the bus and inside a car in front. So I don't know, the answer to your question is, there's a lot more particulate matter and poor air quality inside the bus than a car riding in front of it. Or, and then there's then cars riding to the side too. Where it comes from, it's got to be coming from that engine, I would think. And so, I don't know, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I think the older diesel bus model, the diesel exhaust would concentrate inside the bus.
Right.
And so there's filters now so that some of that pollution is being cut out. So the 2006 model is like what, when we talked to the researchers, they said anything after 2006, those buses have better air quality inside the bus. But again, it's not the same as a zero emissions bus. Yeah.
I was wondering about forgot my question.
Mr. Miller.
So I'm curious, you talked about the grid. What sort of range do these have? Because of course, kids travel long distances here for various events and so on.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. Right now, and like I mentioned in the past, or literally 5 minutes ago, that we also work with a lot of different bus people who work at different bus companies. And what I've heard is it can range from about average of 120 miles to 140. And I know that also usually when a district is first starting an electric school bus, whoever's providing the bus and between the transportation director, usually they'll start them on the shorter routes, just to make sure those work. But however, you know, depending on, you know, they could either do multiple shorter routes or maybe, you know, medium level routes, but it's over 100 across the board.
And second question, I may be imagining this, but I recall that hydrogen is also a potential source of fuel for buses. Am I imagining that, or is that just too experimental at this point?
No, it's hydrogen is working on, particularly in California. I think they have hydrogen vehicles out there. And I'm not a deep expert on this, but the challenge with hydrogen is it takes a lot of fossil fuel to make the hydrogen, right? So the greenhouse gas impact, I think it might even be worse. But you know, if you can make green hydrogen, you know, do you know that? Yeah. Hydrogen study.
So Leeuw Climate Group has a great presentation on this that Barb did. There's like 10 different kinds of hydrogen, so it's really hard to say anything definitive about hydrogen. But if you want clean hydrogen, you have to use a buttload of green energy. If you want pink hydrogen, that's nuclear power making hydrogen using electrolyzers. But the 99% of the hydrogen that's available now is natural gas, where they just strip out the carbon dioxide and vent it to the atmosphere, and then they have hydrogen. So it's extremely energy intensive to produce, and it comes with a huge amount of vented CO2 and I think maybe a little methane. So generally hydrogen's not so clean, and we're working on it, but hydrogen in the best case is a poor storage medium for clean energy. You'd be better to just use the energy and not turn it into hydrogen and have a bunch of wasted energy in the process of converting it to hydrogen and then converting it back.
Yeah, from a greenhouse gas emission. From a zero emission, if the kid's riding in a bus, no tailpipe, right, or it's just dripping water instead of PM 2.5s into the bus. Right, better from a health standpoint on that end, but the downside is the energy to make it.
Well, this may have related to a couple other questions, but as it deals with the grant selection, is there enough grants being awarded to get a sense of what the merits are to end up getting a grant or ending up on a waiting list? Or or that sort of thing? Are they trying to get the most use for the award, which might be one way to look at it, depending on where the school district is. And I don't know if it's related to that or not. Is there any difference between whether the school district is operating the buses or they're contracting out the bus services to, and I don't know what the relative amount of use would be, but it might be greater or lesser.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to first sort of answer the first question that you had, Dan had a slide up that I think we'll be sending the slide deck to you all of how many school districts are interested, and it was much larger than the amount that were awarded. And this is something that we are working on, you know, every time these programs come out, of trying to make them as inclusive as possible. And it's also, you know, 5 billion feels like a very big number, but about a school bus can cost around 400,000, and so that's for one school bus, and then once you're adding that. So that's why we've been really advocating for these state-funded programs. Therefore, they're less competitive. And then also sometimes it's easier, you know, for people to say, oh, well, this came straight from like our home state. And additionally, too, to answer the second question, yes, there is a difference usually in one of the first things that I think I hear, and multiple of us here, if we're telling people, hey, you want to electrify your school bus fleet, they quickly go, oh, we don't own our buses. And we have to follow up with, that's okay. You know, the bus contractor can apply. They're allowed to apply. In all of these applications, there's a third-party applicant, and bus contractors are eligible under that. All that is needed is just basically a consent form between the school district and the bus contractor saying, you know, we consent to knowing this is happening. So it's a very easy step. However, that is one that tends to block a lot of people, and also makes it so they don't want to do that extra step of coordinating. Red Lake actually is getting 4 electric school buses in August, which is very exciting. We're hoping actually to, go up there and celebrate them. But they also do own their buses, which did make this application process easier. But also this isn't to say that it's impossible to do it if you don't, because Minneapolis, they don't own their buses. They were able to get their buses. Multiple other school districts are the same. So.
Wonderful. We've got 2 last questions or remarks before we'll wrap up.
At the beginning of COVID, there was a natural experiment that happened when everybody stayed home and the freeways were empty and the air was clean. And I actually heard that the death rates from various pneumonias and problems that people have because of air pollution went way, way down. And I just thought that that was just a remarkable event that I haven't heard publicized very much.
Thank you for reminding us of what we've learned.
This is just a great presentation you had, and hopefully I can go this afternoon. I really appreciated the flyer you had there, electric versus diesel versus propane. So looking through all the different brochures, there's real no definition or explanation on passenger size for the buses. And so I was curious because I don't know what Ely needs, but you know, there are small van-like buses and there are buses that take what, 40, 60 kids? I don't know. Do you have any info on that?
I think it's based on weights, and then, you know, the EPA Clean School Bus Program, they have different funding amounts for the different size buses. And they fund anything from the biggest school buses you make to some of the smaller ones, but the funding, it will be different depending upon the class and the size. And if you go to the EPA Clean School Bus Program website, they'll kind of show you a chart of the different classes of buses, from the small ones to the large ones, and how much funding they give. So there is funding available for all sizes.
Yeah, and I'd also give a shout out to Paula for making that handout.
All of you, thank you so much for being here. I look forward to learning more from you while you're in town. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.